Good evening, everyone. We are back in our study in the book of Ecclesiastes. We are at chapter 4 this evening. Remember, we were talking about things that is under the sun or under the heavens or under the sky. And the Koheleth would be Solomon himself, looking at things around him, synthesizing, analyzing, gaining insight as to all the things and the people who live around him. So it is important for us to realize that now in chapter 4, he now considers in his dissertation about the people who are oppressed under the sun. Okay, so again, let me just draw this picture for you. We have the person on the land and under the skies, and one of the components would be under the sun. And so he sees the things that is around him, and that is what under the sun actually mean. Now, the key word here is oppression. Now, oppression is ashuk. Oppression means somebody who is, how should we say, someone who is extorted, or someone who is under tyranny. Now, even though there are, in the times of Solomon himself, you would find that there will always be pockets of rich people who would oppress. And in this case, the idea here is to deal unfairly. I think that would be another word for it, to deal unfairly. And so we call this injustice. And so Solomon said he returned back to his entire discussion, and he was actually consider here is to look at. And so in chapter 4 begins a discussion about those who are being dealt unfairly. And this is done under the sun. And says, look, behold, the tears of the oppressed. So when you are under oppression, you shed tears. And this is real tears, meaning you cry because you are treated so unfairly. And they have no consolation. You can't console them. So on the side of their oppressors, they have strength. The idea here would be, they have power, they have ability. And we see that quite often, even in modern day, where you find a rich man or somebody who's a leader or someone who's powerful, and they tend to hide behind their injustice, thinking that he's doing fairly, but they're not. And they oppress their workers, their staff, their community. That's why they have no consolation, right? But they have no consolation. Therefore, I praised the dead who are already dead. This is a strange way of looking at things. The idea here already means for a long time. And I think this is very similar to the Chinese way of saying, I guess the phrase in a more colloquial way would be no I see, right? He's dead already and he doesn't care. And so Solomon is saying those who are dead are much better than the living who are still alive, because the ones who are still alive are under the oppression. So this is linked together. When you're alive, he's now looking at those who are being oppressed. Yes, both he who never existed, who has not seen evil done under the sun, he is much better off. The word praise here is not like praise God kind of thing. This would be, how would you say this? This would be able to calm, to be pacifying or soothing. And so the dead is in a much better position, as well as those who never existed. So because they have they're not able to see. And this word to see is a very concrete way of expressing the evil deeds. So what are evil deeds? The ones who are doing the oppressing, the one who is doing the extorting, the one who is doing the tyranny. And Solomon or the Koheleth is saying, those who never existed, who has died, right, already dead, they are better than those who are alive because they are being oppressed. Those who never existed never had to see the evil that was done under the sun. So now in chapter 4, it turns the attention to another aspect of community life, and the ones that is being held under injustice, being dealt with unfairly, being mistreated, right? And that would be the idea right now in chapter 4. So he says again, I saw. So all the while you see that the Hebrew is very, very practical, very pragmatic. They have to look at things. So I saw that for every toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. Now the word envy here in verse 4 is about jealous, right? It's about jealous. Now, jealous doesn't have to be bad, right? Jealous doesn't have to be bad. But in this case, it is zealous for a negative sense, meaning the neighbor. And in this case, when you say neighbor, it is a fellow man. So every time you see the word neighbor, it's a fellow man. And this word envy is kana. No, God is a jealous God. And thereby that word jealous, kana, same word, is used in a positive sense, in a more protective sense. This time we read of this word envy or jealous in a negative sense, because the fellow man is envious of your skillful work. And what this means is he is desirous, right? Desirous to own what does not belong to him. That is what this means. And so the fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. The idea of fool here would be someone who is silly, arrogant, and possibly somebody who doesn't know God. And this is an expression, consumes his own flesh, looks at the time of a judgment, that he is folding his hands, and that means not toiling. And there is nothing to eat. And so what does he do with his own flesh? His flesh would be to envy, to covet, to lust. Now, these are all similar words. So consumes his own flesh is to allow his flesh to do all these things. And so the conclusion that the Kohelet said is, it is better a handful with quietness than both hands full with toil. Why? Because these are grasping for the wind. Grasping for the wind. What do you mean a handful? Better when you are, how should you say? It is tov with the fullness of your palm, that you have what you need in your hand, right? In your hand, in your palm. And that you can actually, well, I guess you could say this as rest, right? Better to have just what you have in your palm on your hand that you can rest, than you have two hands full but laboring hard. That's what it means. And this idea of labor is trouble, toil, trouble, using effort. And so working needs effort, but this is what the Kohelet is saying, don't overexert yourself. Sometimes it is okay just to have enough in a handful where you can rest. Then you have both hands full and you cannot rest, that you are troubled, because this is also grasping for the wind. When you envy, it's grasping for the wind. When you have two hands full and you're still in labor, you're grasping for the wind because you have no time to rest. And then I returned and I saw vanity under the sun. And so all of this is saying that everything is nebulous. It's a vapor. You can't hold on to. It's not that it's useless, but you can't hang on to it. So why not just enough and you can take rest, then work so hard that you have two hands full and you can't rest. In the next segment, the Kohelet is now saying, if you are alone, you are one and alone, you do not have a companion. Now, this is important for us to understand. The idea here is you are echad, and your existence, your existence is one, right? The word alone is applied. So you exist as one person. You do not have, the word companion means a second person. So let's ignore the word companion for now, right? It doesn't have a meaning here. So Solomon, the Kohelet, is saying, you exist as one without a second. And you don't have a son or a brother. Yet there is no end to all his labors. The word labor here is the same. You're toiling, your pain, what else is there? You're worrying. And you're doing it all alone. So your eye is never satisfied with all the riches you have. Now, nothing wrong with being rich. That's not what it is saying here, right? You are always gaining wealth, but you are one man. You don't have descendants. You don't have family. And you keep working and making more and more money. But the emphasis is you're all alone. So what is happening here in verse 8? He says, for whom do I work so hard? And I deprive myself. And the idea of depriving here is to lack, right? To lack, to lessen of myself, right? And the picture here is, you know what? Why am I losing out? Myself here is nephesh, my soul, lessen my soul from the good. And the good would be the good of life. And so the picture here that is being given is, you work for all the riches. There is no end to all this. You're all one and alone. So who am I doing this for? And I am not giving myself the good of life. And so the Kohelet says this is vanity. And not just vanity. It says here a grave misfortune. Now this translation is a bit problematic. This is vanity. This is vapor. You can't hold on to it. The idea here is this is grave misfortune. It is an evil occupation. Now, understand this. Evil is Ra. And it does not mean evil in a moral sense. It just means that this is not something that is pleasing to yourself in your eyes. It is not agreeable to you. You're working so hard, occupied, being busy, but you have not enjoyed the good of it. You've only seen the evil or the not agreeable side. And so the Kohelet now comes to this point. Just now you are one. So the Kohelet said, two is actually better, more good than one. See, you are one, but the Kohelet says two is better. Why? Because they have a good reward for their labor. Now, what is a good reward? The idea here is good wages, good compensation for what they toil. So whenever they do something, it is a tov. It's a good consequence when you have it done together, right? They means two. That's a very important concept for this verse. Two is they. The two of them will have good compensation for whatever they work for. For if, theoretically speaking, if they fall, one will lift up his companion. Now, again, the word companion doesn't exist. His second. Because we're talking about two people here. Now, the word companion is not really wrong. It's just that it's not how it's expressed. And then the Kohelet says, but woe to him when he is alone. And when he falls, and this is in verse 10. And when he falls, he is one person, right? And there is no second person to help him up. So all of this is talking about the negative of being one. And so two is good because there will be somebody who will help you along. The two of you will work together and you'll be fine. We'll come back to this again, right? Again, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can they be warm alone? And this is about sharing body warmth when you're cold. The one may be overpowered by another. Two can withstand the oppressor. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. The idea here is, what is three? And so some people have suggested that whenever we talk about two, it may be talking about a wife. So two can be implying a wife, right? Especially when you talk about two lying down together. I guess we can't see two men lying down together to keep warm. But the idea here is two is good because you can share the burden. You can double your effort. You can compensate each other. When one falls, the other will hold you up, right? When you lie down, you can share the warmth. And especially when this hint comes, you can have a son, and that makes three. Now, that's one way of looking at this passage here. And I suppose that would work out quite well. And that would be a fairly Jewish way of looking at this passage. Verse 13, and we are here on our last segment. Remember, we started off by talking about the oppressed, people who are dealt with unjustly. And we come to this last segment. There is another category of people in the society, and the ones who are poor, who are humbled, who are humiliated. And the Koheleth also have something to say about them. So you notice the Koheleth is actually walking right across the cross-section of his population. First, he looks at his own as a kingly, and he says, I'm in the same boat. Everything is vain. It's vapor. I can't hang on to it. I still have to work too. I may work a different role, but it's not permanent. Then he talks about a gift of God. We should enjoy ourselves. Then this chapter talks about the one who's oppressed right up front. And now in verse 13, we talk about the poor. The poor literally means the one who have no money. Right? The ones who have no money, the poor man. And then we talk about the poor boy. The word youth here is yelet. Yelet would be a boy, right? A young boy. And so we talk about better a poor but wise. This is wise with insight. And so the Koheleth is now comparing wealth cannot be compared to wisdom. Solomon had lots of money, but it doesn't, there's no comparison. There's money that cannot buy wisdom. Insight of life is a gift of God that you can understand, you can synthesize, you can appreciate, you can experience, and you can give good judgment. And so wisdom is important, very important. Poor, well, you can't get away from that. So a poor but wise young boy is better than an old but foolish king who will be admonished no more, that he cannot take advice. So why do you care of this kind of a king? An old king who is supposed to be able to advise people, but he doesn't know how to advise anymore. He's just old. And the word foolish is silly, right? And you don't know God, you can't take advice. It's of no use. Now we talk about this poor boy again. What does this poor boy do? Right? He comes out of prison to be king. Now, the word prison here doesn't necessarily have to be a prison. It is a place where he is, well, how should we say? He is kept in a kept with a yoke, right? And it can be a place of humiliation. So it can mean a prison, or it can mean a captivity. And so he comes out to be king. So this is all hypothetical. Although he was born poor in his kingdom, he is a better king. And that's what he's saying. This is a better king than an old guard who is silly. He has no use because he cannot take admonishment. He cannot take advice. So when you are poor and you are wise, you can give advice and you can also take advice. So he's looking at that. So a state of mind who is young, who is wise, may be poor. It doesn't matter. And as a leader, he will be a good one. And in verse 15 it says, I saw the living who walk under the sun. They were with the second youth who stands in his place. And that would be the next generation. And he says there was no end of all the people whom he was made king, whom he was made to rule, right? To rule. Don't take the word king as literally be king, but to be in a position of authority. To be in a position of authority. Yet those who come after will not rejoice in him. Surely this is also vanity, grasping for the wind. His conclusion is this. He says, all the living who walks under the sun, there was a second generation who stands in his place. There is no end of all the people over whom he was made king. And the people whom he was made king would be treated very much in the same way, with understanding and goodness, I would say. But the Kohelet said, you know what? Even if this guy was king, in this case, it is short. It is like a vapor. It is not forever. It is for but a short while. So the eyes of the Kohelet looks at the good things of life, looks at the bad things of life, and his conclusion is always the same. The conclusion is it's vanity, it's havel, it's a vapor. It's not for long. It is frustration. You try to hang on to it, but it doesn't last long. And so in his mind is this: if you had it well, it doesn't last long. When you think you are oppressed and dealt with unjustly, it also doesn't last long. Maybe it's better not to be born so that you don't see all these things, because it really etches in your mind the memories that is not good, but then it's also short. What about a poor, wise young man who can stand out to be the next leader? And yet there will be another who comes after him who may not be like that. And so it's one cycle in, one cycle out. Very similar in the thinking of chapter 1. And so he says, you may enjoy all the goodness of life, but why do you work so hard? Wouldn't it be nice that if you have enough in your hands and you could rest, rather than 2 hands full and you keep working and worrying? And so the idea of rest seems to be a positive idea. The idea of being insatiable is no good. The idea of folding your hands, not working, is also no good. So work is good, but work in a manner where you can rest. And thereby gives us the picture that God taught in Genesis chapter 2, right? You work for 6 days, but on the seventh day, you shall cease from working. That would be your Shabbat, your rest. And that is where the Koheleth is thinking through life. Whatever it may be, it is still Hevel. It is short. And it won't hang on for long. Now, this chapter is hanging, I must say, because it follows on immediately to chapter 5. So let me just take a look at chapter 5, and then we'll continue tomorrow, because I want us not to leave chapter 4 on the downside, but to look at it from the upside. And so looking at everything, it seems to be vanity, grasping for the wind. It's brief, it's nebulous, it's like a vapor. You can't hang on to it. So what would the Koheleth say? Whether you are oppressed, whether you are insolent, whether you work hard, you have rest. Well, at the end of the day, there is a balance to all these things. Yes, you have to work. It's a God-given occupation, but work smart. Work to enjoy your life. Work to respect it that is good from the eyes of God. And he says another in chapter 5. And I wanted to take a look at chapter 5, verse 1, so that we can continue tomorrow. He says, walk prudently. You find that this word walk prudently is to, how should we say, we walk in pace, right? Keep in pace. Keep in pace when you walk to the house of God. Now, what do you mean keep in pace? Keep in pace means, when you walk in your foot or your footsteps is walking, how would you say? It is walking in a rhythm, right? That you need to keep that pace, right? Keep your footsteps as you walk to the house of God. Now, many a times you think that, well, the Koheleth never speaks much about God, but he does. At every critical juncture, right at the end of chapter 4, when it gets to chapter 5, he mentions the house of God, and that would be the temple. Now, you will notice, although we say it's chapter 5, this is actually in the Hebrew Bible, chapter 4, verse 17. It's a continuation, so I didn't want to end there. It says, draw near to hear. To hear. Do you remember what is to hear? To Shema. We read in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, hear ye, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one Lord. Shema. To hear means to pick up the sounds, to hear what is being said, to understand it, and to make decisions to do what God tells us to. Rather than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they do evil. Now, the word evil here is ra, and this would be evil in God's eyes, because you're in the house of God, right? So what do you mean when you sacrifice? And the word sacrifice always talks about a slaughter, killing an animal perhaps, and shedding the blood. But the fools, the silly ones, that they don't listen to God, right? This word here is contrasted to sacrifice of fools. we must be very careful with this verse. To hear is contrasted with to give sacrifice of fools. What do you think God wants in this? So it says, keep in pace when you walk up to the house of God, the temple. Always when you draw near to the temple, the place of God, the presence of God, you need to hear him. The fools, they don't listen. They think giving sacrifice is good enough. We have read in the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, in Micah, God doesn't really care about sacrifice if you're not right with him. So a fool, by definition, is not right with God. When you're not right with God and you give sacrifice, you slaughter, and you think you're doing what God is saying, God really doesn't care. If a person doesn't have a right relationship with God, all these rituals become meaningless. And that's why they say, for they do not know that what they do is not right in God's eyes. And so I think this is a good place to end. That in the wisdom of Solomon, he is telling us, no, while we are busy, we must be mindful to rest. Make sure that we know where contentment is. Be aware, two is better than one. And God hears the oppressed. But all of these is short. It doesn't last long. But what is more valuable as a lesson of life is draw near to the house of God. Draw near to God. Remember God. Come back to the house of God. But not for the sacrifice where you are not in a right relationship with God. But what does God want us to do? To hear him. Hear his words. Do what he says. Not the ritual itself. Because it has no meaning if we are not obeying God. And so another word for this is to obey. So if you don't obey God, that offering sacrifice is of no use to God, because in God's eyes, he sees it as ra, as evil. And with this, we end chapter 4.